Okay.
حاله اسفندیاری around the Middle East program. May I have your attention, please? Thank you. I'd like to thank you for coming, and so sorry that we had to reschedule this meeting from yesterday to today because we were concerned about the roads, and also the federal government had delayed the opening of the building to 10 o'clock and then 12 o'clock. We were told that 10 people who had not received the email we sent out late Sunday night came to the center to attend the meeting. If they happen to be in the audience, my apologies to them, but they should have checked it. We have with us today three top Iran experts who will share their views on if and when Iran will decide to come to the table to tell us what we can expect from the talk. Iran is saddled with domestic and foreign policy problems. It is not just the nuclear issue, but the sanctions, Iran relations with its neighbors, concern about the turmoil in Syria, Iran's closest ally in the region, and the domestic problems are both economical and political, factionism and domestic repression. We just heard over the weekend 12 Iranian journalists were arrested, and there is always this sort of vague charge that they were involved in trying to overthrow the regime. And so by the time they try and figure out and prove this charge, number of months or years will pass. There has been a rise in the cost of living in Iran, and of course the fall of the rial and social harassment. Among the problems that Iran faces now, there are some minor problems too. For example, we went through was it the
chicken crisis? Yeah.
Chicken crisis. Apparently, it has been revived. The last couple of days, there is again a chicken crisis in Iran. You may want to talk about the chicken crisis briefly, and also the existing pollution. And this all is causing a kind of restlessness among not only the ruling class, but the people. So therefore, to describe all these difficult and sometimes funny, most of the times very depressing issues that Iran is facing, we have Bijan Khajehpour, Alireza Nader, and Michael Adler with us. Bijan is going to talk about the impact of the Iranian economy on the political decision. We then will go to Alireza Nader, who is going to talk about Khamenei's mounting pressures, and finally Michael Adler will discuss showdown for Iranian talks. We have distributed their bios, so I'm not going to take more of your time. We'll start with Bijan, and then I'll ask them maybe one or two questions, and then we'll open the floor.
How many minutes do we?
15.
15, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. I want to congratulate Hale for creating exactly Iranian conditions for this event. You know, things get cancelled last minute, and then they still take place the next day. I'm glad it worked out, and I'm glad to be here. As Hale said, I will talk about the economy, and then we'll try to connect the economic developments to the political question of whether Iran will negotiate, and if yes, when. There is an agreement among the experts that the 2012 economic conditions in Iran were probably the worst since the end of the Iran-Iraq war in 1988. This is a sad reality, but it's very clear. I will also show you the statistics to prove this point. Obviously, external sanctions, and I know this is one of the biggest questions, external sanctions have played a role in bringing about this economic situation. But I keep repeating myself here, and I want to underline that the sanctions are not the only issue in Iran. Ask the question, who is actually really suffering as a result of these sanctions? Because it's not a unified picture. You can't say the whole economy is suffering. There are segments of the Iranian economy and segments of the ruling elite that are actually not suffering. In fact, there are some benefits. I will come to these benefits later. And obviously the key question, will it lead to a different political dynamics? And as I said, I will start with some statistics and then we'll conclude. Quick snapshot, and this is all the red figures are critical figures, critical indicators for the Iranian economy. First of all, even though in real figures the economy is growing, this is the growth this year and next year, in dollar figures, the economy is contracting heavily. You know, this is the contraction from last year, 2000, basically last Iranian year to the current Iranian year, and it's going to go down next Iranian year as well in dollar terms, obviously, partly because of the exchange rate correction, but also partly because the economy is contracting in certain segments and sectors. If you look at the per capita GDP in dollar terms, these are the declines. So from last year to this year, about 27% decline in dollars, not in reals. And from this year to next year, about 23%. Inflation, you have official and unofficial figures. I will come back to inflation, especially because there was a thesis about hyperinflation in Iran. I want to explain growth in non-oil exports. The balance of trade and the balance of payments have remained positive in Iran. So this year, a balance of a trade surplus of $33 billion. Next year, even higher. I will come back to this figure because this is a big puzzle. You know, how can this economy suffer so much, lose so much export income, and still produce a trade surplus? You will see that the negative impact is flowing into a different segment, which I will come back to. Let's move forward. I promised to talk about inflation. I fully disagree with the hyperinflation scenario that was presented here in the US about the Iranian economy, but I want to explain why you can get so many different figures. And these figures are very accurate. It's researched by our own company in Iran, by the Ati Group. We produce something called the cost of living survey. We have baskets of goods that have been put together actually by the UN. So these are UN designed baskets of goods. And the interesting thing is, depending on how you put together the basket of goods and what category of goods, whether it's imported goods or domestically produced goods, you get different figures. Just to show you the discrepancy. So if you have these four different categories, if you take a family that uses 50% imported goods and 50% domestically produced goods, you get to an inflation of about 43% in the past 12 months. Now, if you take one that uses 90% domestic goods and 10% imported, then the inflation figure is 33%. Now, the government produces one for 100% domestic goods, and in some cases subsidized prices, hence and inflation of about 29%. Now, if you take 100% imported goods, then you get to something like 60 to 70%. Obviously, you can play with the basket of goods. You can play with the composition of domestic versus thing. But we are not, from an economic point of view, not witnessing a hyperinflation scenario, but it's a very high inflation. I mentioned the decline in the per capita GDP. The peak was 2010, about $5,300. It has been dropping since. These drops here were directly connected to the exchange rate corrections. You know, we had 3 exchange rate corrections, and obviously you see the impact. But then here, from 2011 onwards, we are witnessing economic decline. So it's not just an economic adjustment because of exchange rate corrections, but also there is economic decline. This is an important graph to look at. These are the per capita export and import figures in Iran since 2007. So we have the red line is the per capita total export income. So total oil and non-oil. The blue one is the per capita oil export, and you can see that it has dropped since the intensification of external sanctions on oil. But then the interesting thing is the green line is the per capita import figure. So you see the pattern. Whenever the export revenue drops, you spend less money on imports. Hence, there is always a trade surplus. So it's not that they will keep, if they would have kept, just look here, if they would have kept the import levels like 2011, we would have faced a trade deficit in 2012. But immediate reaction from a trading nation, if you don't earn as much exporting, then reduce your import bill. And once you reduce your import bill, the first thing that happens is that you basically import lower quality products. Instead of European products or Western products, you start importing Indian products and Russian products and Chinese products. And this is one of the problems that the Iranian society is facing as a whole. Just another element, let me go back. This is roughly the per capita oil export income, so about $800. This year, slightly higher next year, because the reason it's going higher is Iran is exporting more gas. When I say oil, is oil and gas. So there is more gas exports. And this is a historical view. The green line is the oil production level. So I'm sorry, oil export level. And the blue line is the per capita export earning of Iran per year. Again, here you see that it has come down. The peak was about $1,000 per capita, but it has come down, and here it reaches that roughly $750, $800. The point I want to make is, for most of the past 3 decades, the per capita export income, oil income of Iran was below 500. So Iran has not reached a critical point as yet. It's an economy that can, obviously it has to cut back, but it can survive with lower than $500 per capita oil export income. And it hopes that other exports will be added. Now the point I was making about the balance of payments, because somehow you have to understand where this damage is being done, because it's clear an economy that's exporting less, producing less, there has to be some damage inflicted somewhere, and this is the damage that's inflicted in Iran. This is the balance of trade, so basically the trade surplus. This is the balance of payments, but this is the balance of capital account. And as you can see, for years, it has been negative, and it's now deteriorating. Basically, 2012, the Iranian economy as a whole had about $25 billion less assets, less capital accounts compared to a year earlier. And next year, it will go down by about $27 billion. So where the damage is being inflicted is that the asset base, the capital base, the capital account of the Iranian economy is declining. And that's important to understand. So when you look at the statistics, also look at this element of the statistics. The next point is the multi-tiered exchange rate. Those of you who have come to my talks, you have followed this. And now we have a three-tiered exchange rate system. I was, for example, hoping in a way that the government would correct this lower rate because it's not realistic. We all know that. And the fact that there are these three rates opens doors to corruption because those who have access to this lower rate get something at this rate, sell it at that rate, and they have already doubled their money without doing much. They haven't done that, and it's important to understand why they haven't done that. I think they have now come to the conclusion that with this lower rate, they can look after the lower income classes. Basically, food imports and pharmaceutical imports are being imported at this rate. Everything else is up here. But the classes, the lower income classes that are more important to the top leadership of the Islamic Republic, it's basically about keeping them happy. For example, you may have just heard the announcement a couple of days ago that the government is going to pay an extra cash handout before the Iranian New Year to the lower income families. And these are all instruments they are using to look after the lower income classes. And in a way, they are saying this class is more important to us. The middle class and the upper class, they are the supporters of the green movement anyhow, so why shall we bother about them? So you are seeing a type of discrimination in the policies, and there may be a return to sort of a different way of subsidies towards the lower income classes. Now, I told you at the beginning there are some forces who actually benefit from the current situation, from the crisis mode that we are in. And in a way, the government and also the semi-governmental entities, foundations, military foundations, and so on, they are actually benefiting from the current conditions. Why? One, the government can very easily hide behind the sanctions. I mean, they can basically say all the problems we have, and Ahmadinejad has been doing this, has been, escaping confrontations with the parliament and so on, saying, we have to focus on managing the situation with the sanctions. Whereas everyone knows that this is not just a consequence of the sanctions. For one good example is oil production capacity. I mean, the decline in oil production capacity is a long-term phenomenon in Iran. It has nothing to do with the past couple of years. It has happened because of the lack of investment in the oil and gas sector and lack of technology. But now they can just say, well, we are being sanctioned, and hence it's not the government's fault. The status quo, multi-tiered exchange rate system, indirect trading routes, indirect banking routes, these all basically pave the way for corruption, opaqueness, and so on. And who benefits from that? All those people who have access to these rates and to these import licenses and so on. Obviously, again, the government and semi-government. Obviously, all types of dissent and protests are being clamped down on because they say, well, it's a emergency situation. We are being sanctioned. We are under pressure, and they're basically managing the political aspect by referring to the sanctions crisis. There are also some small benefits for the private sector, especially because of some new rules. For example, the export of oil and export of petrochemicals that's going through some private companies. But it's very limited. The main beneficiaries are the government and the semi-government. And I mentioned the multi-tiered exchange rate. And the other benefit is that if Iran can't sell its oil, it's going to invest more and more in value-add products, oil products. And that is happening on a smaller scale, but it's happening. So I will conclude now with some outlooks. First of all, the Iranian economy has suffered. There is no doubt about it. You saw the picture. It's declining. The per capita income is declining and so on. But I don't think it has reached a position where Iran is going to feel compelled to come and soften its approach. And one reason why is because, as I said, some of the key political constituencies are actually benefiting from the crisis mode. There won't be a softening for different reasons, and I think it's important to distinguish the different reasons. Some of the segments, like Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, the Basij, some of the confidence networks around him, they completely distrust the West. So even if they feel that the economy is under a lot of stress, the distrust is going to impede negotiation. Other segments, especially some of the semi-governmental business networks, they're actually benefiting from the current status. Do you think under normal circumstances the Minister of Intelligence could just walk in to the newspapers and arrest 14 journalists, but they can say, well, it's a critical situation, we have to do that, we have to avert the next soft revolution and so on. And those who are suffering, like the private sector, like some of the private businesses and so on, they don't have the power to change the nuclear strategy, the nuclear negotiation strategy, but they are pushing to liberalize the economy, to say, okay, if the economy is more liberalized, we can manage the pressure of sanctions better. That's the only thing that's happening. And then there is another aspect. If I've always argued the Iranians are bad managers, but good crisis managers, I think for historical reasons. And some people are saying, well, this crisis is helping us manage some of our other issues, manage some of our economic issues, efficiency issues, and so on. And it's a time to push through some of the plans that had been stuck in the system, like the subsidy reforms, like a more serious approach to privatization. In this picture, the losers are the private sector and the middle class of Iran. The middle class is suffering. I showed it to you. And the sad news is these are actually the only proponents of a democratization of the country. So we are actually, the external policy situation is undermining the main pro-reform, pro-democracy players. So the outlook, unfortunately, more of the same. Unless there is a change in the Western approach to the negotiations, I don't think we can expect a shift, a major or significant shift from the Iranian position. Thank you.
Thank you for finishing on such a gloom and doom. Very nice. Alireza Aghay Khamenei, which I don't think is going to be less cheerful, more cheerful than what we are.
No, I don't think I can be more cheerful. The title of the talk is Why is Iran Negotiating? Things have changed a little bit, I think, since you planned the panel. So maybe we can call it Why is Iran Not Negotiating? When will Iran negotiate? Currently, of course, as you know, Iran agreed to meet in February. They're supposed to meet the P5+1, the UN Security Council plus Germany in January. There's been a delay in the process, and there are various theories as to why Tehran is delaying things. One theory is that there's political division in Iran, that Iran is paralyzed by infighting, as we saw in 2009 during the presidential election, after the election. I don't personally buy that. I think that the Iranian negotiating team knows exactly what it's doing. It's getting its orders from the very high up, from the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And if Khamenei makes the decision to move forward, Iran will move forward, because he's the most powerful man in Iran. And he's consolidated power since 2009, and he's making really all the decisions for the country. And Khamenei is a man that's stubborn. He's stuck in a very specific mindset. He is not a worldly man. He's a cleric. He has a very narrow vision of the world. And I think he's informed by people who are basically telling him what he wants to hear. And this is what happens when you amass a lot of power. In a lot of ways, Iran's former ruler, the Shah, was also cut off from reality. So I think that's one of the issues. I also think he does not trust the P5+1, the West, specifically the United States. He doesn't think he's getting a good deal. Iran has been asked to give up its 20% enriched uranium, to stop enriching uranium up to 20%, and to close down Fordo. And I think for an initial phase of negotiations, the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khamenei, does not trust this deal. And rationally, you can argue that he's right, that he shouldn't trust the United States. And the United States should not trust the Islamic Republic either. I think it's an issue of sequencing. One side wants the other to undertake measures to build confidence, and the other side expects the same. So that's why we see the stalemate. I would say that we shouldn't get panicky. The process is not dead. We still have a lot of time to achieve a peaceful solution. But specifically, I want to talk about the mounting pressures on Ayatollah Khamenei, because although he's stuck in this approach, his ideological viewpoint toward the United States, he's facing a lot of pressure from the various components and constituents within the Islamic Republic. Iran is not a totalitarian country. Of course, Khamenei is the most powerful person, but he has to consider the various factions, decision makers, the Bazaar, the Revolutionary Guards, etc. And I would define 4 broad categories of pressure being applied to Khamenei. The first, the reformists and the pragmatic conservatives. The second, the Ahmadinejad camp. The third, the pro-Khamenei conservatives. And the fourth, finally, the Iranian population. And we have to frame this within the upcoming presidential election in June. I'm not going to go into great detail about that. It's an entirely different topic of conversation. But that's how we should frame it, because that's how the Islamic Republic views nuclear negotiations within the framework of the internal power struggle within Iran. So the reformists, of course, they're out of play in a lot of ways. They're not within the inner circle of the regime. They're not making decisions on a day-to-day basis. More likely than not, they're not shaping strategy on nuclear negotiations. But I wouldn't write them off completely. They're still an important component of the political system, the Islamic Republic, and society in general. They've been greatly weakened due to the crushing of the post-election, 2009 election protests, but they're still there. They can affect some change. Of course, 2 of their main leaders, Mehdi Karoubi and Mir Hossein Mousavi, are under house arrest. We don't hear very much about them. I think it's either Mousavi or Karoubi's children have complained that they can't get in touch with their Mousavi's daughters, I believe. They can't get in touch with their father. The other prominent reformist leader, former President Mohammad Khatami, is still free. He's not under house arrest. And the reformists, along with the more, if you want to call them pragmatic conservatives, are talking about free elections. That's their motto, that Iran should have free and fair elections. Ayatollah Rafsanjani has talked about having elections that meet global standards of fairness. And Khamenei's reaction has been to say that when they talk about free and fair elections, that means sedition. That anybody who talks about free elections means to undermine the Islamic Republic and is pro-Western and is part of the Velvet Revolution. So that camp is trying to get back into the game. Some conservative figures, including within the Revolutionary Guards, have said that they can participate in elections if they were not part of the sedition and if they apologize for their past activities. I would say that more likely than not, the reformists will not be allowed to contest the elections, that the Guardian Council will not allow any of their candidates to run. I pretty much think Khatami is out. Some of the other more moderate figures that were not part of the so-called sedition may be able to run. The Rafsanjani camp has also been weakened. Rafsanjani's daughter is in jail. His son is under investigation and could go back into jail. But again, although they're not making decisions, they could play a critical role in the future. So there's that camp. There's the Ahmadinejad camp, which is a lot stronger. Of course, President Ahmadinejad has seen a lot of his power diminish in the last few months and last couple of years, really. But the Ahmadinejad camp wants to make sure that the Khamenei camp doesn't steal the election, basically. Ahmadinejad's deputy, Esfandiar Rahim Mashai, who's also his in-law, has been discussed as a potential candidate for the presidential election. A lot of pro-Khamenei conservatives are against him. They think he's anti-clerical, that he's tied to the anti-clerical Hojatiya society, and that the Ahmadinejad camp wants to basically sideline the supreme leader and the clergy. But the Ahmadinejad camp is going to try to come up with other figures to run besides Mashai. Some of Ahmadinejad's former aides could be potential candidates if they're not disqualified by the Guardian Council. I think the pro-Khamenei conservatives are the most important constituency within Iran. And Bijan discussed that the regime really cares about the lower classes, that it will try to make sure that the lower classes are taken care of. But when we look at the Islamic Republic, we have to realize that under Khamenei, a lot of people have become very wealthy, including members of the clergy, but especially the Revolutionary Guards, who today in Iran, along with Khamenei, make the decisions on important national security and domestic political issues. Particularly since Ahmadinejad became president, the Revolutionary Guards, individual members, not the Revolutionary Guards as a military force, but also individual members, have become very wealthy. The Guards have admitted that they have received billions of dollars in no-bid contracts under the Ahmadinejad administration. They're highly dependent on Iran's oil and gas economy. They're dependent on exports. And so far, there's little indication that the Revolutionary Guards are feeling the economic pressure. Now, I would argue that prior to the strongest sanctions placed against Iran, the sanction against the central bank and the European oil embargo, the Revolutionary Guards were actually benefiting from sanctions. That sanctions were allowing the Revolutionary Guards to monopolize the economy. However, if Iran is unable to sell its oil or natural gas, and there's a strong possibility we may come to that point if negotiations fail completely, then that will hurt the Revolutionary Guards as well. And it's not just a matter of oil income. When we look at Iran's other industries, they're in severe decline. For example, automaking in Iran, which the Revolutionary Guards is involved in, is one of the biggest industries. Iran exports a lot of cars. There's a huge domestic market. And car making, according to some reports, has declined by 50%. Export of other goods, including Persian rugs, saffron, is in decline. So it's not just oil, it's the rest of the economy that is suffering as well. And at some point, the Revolutionary Guards are going to be squeezed a lot harder. They're probably being squeezed now. They're not feeling the effects as much as the regular average Iranian on the street, but they're going to feel the squeeze. And Ayatollah Khamenei is relying on the Guards to maintain his power. He has made an implicit deal with them. They buttress his authority. They hold back the reformists and people like Rafsanjani, and he rewards them. And it's not, the Islamic Republic is an ideological political system, but these people also care about money. It's not just about their devotion to the supreme leader as a leader of the revolution. It's not just religious devotion. A lot of them care about money. I haven't seen much to suggest that they're unhappy with Iran's nuclear policy. The regime has been very good in keeping everybody in line regarding that policy. the Supreme Leader's foreign policy advisor, former foreign minister Ali Velayati, just spoke the other day, and he said there's no disagreement on the nuclear program. Everybody agrees. But that's hard to believe given the increasing costs of Iran's nuclear program. Some key conservative and Revolutionary Guards figures have criticized Khamenei for his domestic politics. The former head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Navy compared Khamenei to the former Shah. I think about a year ago, and there were a lot of protests against him. In the past few weeks, a key conservative and one of the wealthiest men in Iran, Habibullah Askar Oladi, who's the head of the conservative Islamic Coalition Party, spoke about releasing Mousavi and Karoubi, implicitly criticizing Khamenei for his policy of keeping him under arrest. So there's dissent against Khamenei within the conservative camp as well. And I think as time goes by, these pressures will build up against the regime from these various constituencies. But finally, I think the Iranian population will not stand by idly and see their country come to ruin. And I understand that subsidies, cash payments may make some individuals happy and make them, allow them to live their lives on a day-to-day basis. But the Iranian population realizes that their country has a lot of potential. There's a big middle class in Iran. It's well educated. There is an upper class, and they're not all secular. A lot of them are religious. A lot of them are members of the Revolutionary Guards. And I have a hard time believing that as time goes by, as Iran faces increasing sanctions, as Iran becomes isolated, that the population will not rise up. I'm not predicting a revolution. It's hard to predict that. But when we look at the rest of the Middle East, when we look at Egypt, Syria, the Islamic Republic in a lot of ways is not very different. It's an authoritarian government. Khamenei has to rely on funds and also repression to maintain his authority. And I don't think he can continue on this path indefinitely. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll do the Michael. Will you want to come to the table
What?
or not?
No, this is fascinating because we've gotten such an incredible picture of the Iranian economy on what's going inside in Iran. And I'm going to try to take you like a Google map or something out of that and look a little bit at more the global picture and above all at the incredible rift there is between both sides in terms of negotiating on this crisis, and maybe take a small look at a way forward. And the beginning of my talk, I was just going to say the same thing as Ali. It's not why have the Iranians decided to negotiate. The real theme now is why have the Iranians not yet decided to negotiate. And it's clear things don't seem to be going well. The talks were supposed to take place in January. The United States and its allies proposed a date, January 15th, which they thought would work, and Iran has not signed on to that date. And when Iran agreed later to January 28th as a possible date, they started changing opinions on where the talks should be and eventually proposed Cairo. No one took them seriously, and there'd be a lot of reasons why Iran would like to mollify the Egyptians and give them their own on that. But the bottom line is there are no talks this month, and there are no talks scheduled yet for February. So I thought the first thing I would do is look at the sort of the nut of the problem, which is the Iranian nuclear program, and also look at this. You've had this swelling chorus of people saying that 2013 is the year, that the Israelis held off, but come mid-2013, this is when the Israelis might take action. So the first thing I wanted to do was to look at the Iranian nuclear program and look at 2013, and to say, as Ali said, that we really have more time than you might think we have. Now the problem, the area of concern, is that people feel that by mid-2003, Iran will reach the breakout capability where they could very quickly and perhaps in secret get enough high-enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon. And the reason for that is that they have started enriching to 20%. Just quickly, I'm sure you all know this, that uranium is enriched for the isotope U-235, and it's enriched up to 5% for civilian reactors. It's enriched up to 20% or more for some research reactors, and over 90% is the enrichment you need to make a weapon. And enrichment is an exponential process, so 20% is actually 90% of the way to getting what you need for a weapon. And the problem is that Iran has been enriching to 20%, and they've enriched a large amount of uranium. They currently have a stockpile of about 130 kilograms. That's not enough to make a weapon, but if they get to about 200 to 230, 250, that would be enough, and they would start to reach that number in about the middle of 2013. So that's one of the reasons why that date has become so important. But what we have found, and also at the same time, Iran is completely not cooperating with the UN nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the International Atomic Energy Agency's remaining questions to Iran are precisely on the possible military dimensions of their work, what they're doing in terms of studying how to make a weapon. So you put those two things together, and you get a kind of crisis atmosphere. And the fear, of course, is that we're going to reach the point where after a decade, remember this crisis began in 2002 when the Iranian resistance group revealed that Iran was hiding nuclear work, and then the IAEA investigation began in 2003. So we have pretty much a decade on, and the fear is that we're going to get to a point where it will boil down to a stark binary choice of living with an Iranian atomic bomb or having to bomb the Islamic Republic to stop this. And this is the concern. But it may not be so critical so quickly because Iran's technological progress is not going that quickly. It's a slow-moving program, not a quick-moving program. And Iran still is working on getting its second enrichment site, Fordow, the one that's built under a mountain and is believed impregnable to air attack. They have not fully outfitted that site. All the centrifuges aren't turning there. In addition, Iran has not managed to get the sophisticated, more developed centrifuges turning, which would make the enrichment process much faster. Because if you're talking about Iran breaking out, the key would be to have enough 20% or 30%, whatever level they get to, of enriched uranium lying around, and you could quickly, say, in a period of less than 2 weeks, which is the time between nuclear inspections, produce the 90% enriched uranium you need. If Iran reaches that point, they certainly could break out, and we would know about it after the fact, not before the fact. But a report released this month by a group of experts, the U.S. Middle East Non-Proliferation Strategy, placed mid-2004, and not this year, as when they would reach that stage. And 2014, what did I say?
4, you said.
Well, that would have been something, but it's 2014. And Israeli intelligence has reportedly decided that Iran would be unable to produce a nuclear weapon until 2015 at the earliest. One Israeli intelligence officer was quoted saying that the delay is not due to sabotage, these covert operations that you hear about alone. He said, quote, "There has not been the run towards a nuclear bomb that some people feared. There was a deliberate slowing on their end." So if Iran is going slow, if Iran is not turning all the centrifuges it could at Fordow, if this is a political decision not to get to the point where action would have to be taken against them, then one, the program is less threatening than we thought 6 months ago, and two, it's a sign that Iran is using its capabilities, still looking towards some kind of negotiations. And also, just a quick note, this crisis has gone on for 10 years. There have been a series of red lines where people said, if Iran does this, there will be bombing. And it's amazing how each red line has gone to pink and white and disappeared entirely. And just to point them out quickly, in 2006, Iran resumed enrichment after having suspended it in 2003. Nothing happened. In 2007, Iran finally had 3,000 centrifuges turning. And this was a big red line. Nothing happened. And in 2012, Iran reached what Israel had called a point of no return when they significantly increased their enrichment and started enriching to 20% at Fordow, and nothing happened. And certainly Fordow was a very significant red line for the Israelis, and nothing happened. And the reason for this is because diplomacy still looks a lot better than military action. So in terms of timing, we may find that the crisis will continue on 2014, maybe 2015, as this process goes on. Now, one thing the Iranians are certainly trying to do is to prolong the process as much as they can. And one way they do this is by talking and by postponing talks, but holding out the promise that talks can still take place. And their purpose in this, at this point, is clearly to avoid further sanctions and to give themselves time to pursue their nuclear work. Speaking to a European diplomat, he told me that several sites, several venues had been proposed. We do not exclude any, but Iran is proposing different venue sites to hold the talks all the time. The venue is not the issue, but Iran appears to be trying to delay the process by coming up with new conditions. And a Western diplomat told me, I think their purpose all along was to get as many meetings as they could in order to talk as little as they can. He said if one of the reasons they were reluctant to engage before the U.S. presidential election was the election, we have to engage them regularly to see whether they are serious. And if they are not serious, whether they are potentially serious if we put this or that on the table. At the same time, we have to keep up the pressure with sanctions. That's the key. And I heard your chuckles. Obviously, it seems to get silly, but it does go on and on. Now, I'd like to quickly review the talks which have taken place and the nature of the blockage in the talks. Three rounds of talks, very significant talks, were held last year in Istanbul, Baghdad, and Moscow. And in previous talks, the Iranians had come in, spoken about world peace, the capitalistic system, and not talked about the nuclear issue, which they said they didn't want to talk about. What happened in Istanbul, which was in April, was that the Iranians spoke seriously. And the United States and its negotiating allies, Britain, China, France, Russia, and Germany, were very excited after Istanbul. And then they submitted in Baghdad their proposal, which was that Iran give up 20% enrichment, and if Iran gave up 20% enrichment, shut down Fordow, shipped out the 20% they had made, then the real talks could begin towards alleviating sanctions on Iran. The Iranian reaction, not surprisingly, was, we came here to get sanctions lifted. This is not sufficient. Baghdad was a disaster. There was a sandstorm, and because there was a sandstorm, they managed to talk for a day more. Otherwise, it would have broken up early. Then the meeting comes to Moscow, and in Moscow, the P5+1, the 6 negotiating nations, did not change their position at all. And the United States, as the talk in Moscow went on, became increasingly hardline, saying it's the 20% or we can't do anything with you. And the Iranians, on their side, became increasingly stubborn, saying this is not the way to talk. You can't expect us just to give up the 20% without a concession on your part. And Moscow ended in a total breakdown in the talks. And the only reason that some expert talks went on after Moscow is that the Russians said to their negotiating allies, we don't want everybody to leave Moscow with dirty dishes, so please continue talking. But basically the talks broke down. So now when the US election has taken place, there's hopefully a new chance for talks, the Iranians are looking at the fact that the P5+1 position has not changed at all. The proposal has been rewritten to take into account the additional centrifuges which have been put into Fordow, and basically to say you must stop 20% first. There's a slight concession in the proposal, which is that sanctions would be lifted on precious metals. But this has nothing to do with sanctions being lifted on the central bank or on Iran's ability to sell oil. The Iranians, understandably, are reluctant to come to the table at this point because talks like this are doomed to failure. And when the talks fail, Iran is afraid that it will be blamed for the failure and that this will be given a rationale for further sanctions against it. So that is one reason why Iran doesn't want to come to talk. So this does not sound like a process which is ready to end anytime soon. Additional factor, which is negative for the talks, is that first the New Year's celebration begins in Iran in March, and then there will be the campaign for the presidential elections. And it's hard to see Iran, which waited to see what happened in the U.S. election, negotiating seriously until their election's over and they know which administration will be negotiating. So here you have Iran feeling that there's nothing in them for the talks, that the proposal they want to give, which is that their right to enrichment be recognized, and that they're able to go forward in that way, is not being heard, means that there is a standoff. And the standoff has not changed since Moscow. This makes talks not likely. Does it doom talks? I don't think at all. In speaking to Western and U.S. Officials, there is a feeling that there will be talks in February, that Iran will come to the table. And I think on the American side, there is a feeling that the medium is more than the message, and that when the two sides finally do sit down to talks, perhaps some signals can be given that there is light at the end of the tunnel and that a deal can be worked out. Whether this optimism is warranted or not, I don't know. But you do have a new Secretary of State. I think he's been confirmed today. You will have a new Secretary of Defense. You do have, excuse me, the President in his inaugural speech stressed that that there should be talks, that diplomacy still should be tried. So as dim as things look, it is not over, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens when the two sides sit down again. And I hope we don't get into the modality where we have to wonder if the two sides will sit down again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Going to open the floor to your questions. Yes, please,
I was curious if,
can you wait for the microphone, please? Yes, thank you. And could I ask you to identify
Sure.
yourself?
Hi, I'm Sina. I'm a graduate student here, and I was curious if you could, this is for the panel, if you could comment on how the war in Syria, Iran's involvement in Syria, has affected its economy, if any, and then whether that effect has sort of affected Iran's calculus in terms of the nuclear program, in terms of how it deals with sanctions, if it doesn't deal with sanctions, if, you know, how it prioritizes, you know, its economy, you know, Syria versus the nuclear program.
Thank you.
Syria was not that important for the Iranian economy. I mean, yes, there were economic dealings, and Iran was selling oil to Syria, still probably transfer some oil to Syria, was exporting some of the cars that Ali Reza mentioned to Syria. So that may have broken down, but it's not a big issue for Iran. I think Syria's main significance for Iran is strategic, in its strategic competition against Israel. So that element is important, and that's why Iran is very very keen to, you know, not allow Syria to move into a completely different setup. But the way Syria plays into the nuclear negotiations is important, and I think that was one of the reasons why Iran was insisting on Cairo as the venue. Iran would like to bring Syria into the negotiations. So instead of just talking about the nuclear issue, to talk about Syria as one case, but also about other regional issues. Basically, Iran is saying we have wider concerns than just the nuclear issue. And obviously, Cairo as a host, or the, you know, Egyptian government as a host, would have been more amenable to that kind of a suggestion, because they are also more more concerned about the Syrian situation. So not that much an economic phenomenon, but yes, regional and also a negotiation element. And I believe one of the reasons Iran is not cooperating at all on Syria is the disappointment in Western sanctions. You know, they're basically one of the ways of Iran reacting and saying, you know, if we are put under pressure and sanctions, no matter what we do, then we just won't do anything, you know.
Adreza, you want to add something?
It's serious important for nuclear negotiations. I don't think economically it's very important for Iran. And Iran, like Bijan said, wants to discuss Syria in terms of the nuclear program because Islamic Republic sees the nuclear issue as being a strategic issue. It's not just about the nuclear program. It's about everything else as well. And I think that's one of the main problems when it comes to negotiating with Iran, that it's not just about the nuclear program. It's about U.S.-Iranian relations. It's about the Islamic Republic's legitimacy, its grip on power. So it's not just about finding a venue and coming to some sort of settlement on the nuclear program. It's about everything else.
We had last Friday 2 Iranian former MPs speaking here. They were part of the 7 former Iranian MPs who had signed an open letter addressed to Ayatollah Khamenei, President Obama, and Ms. Ashton. The link to that discussion is on our website, but they were arguing that they feel that Iran might be, I mean they were saying is, but I say might be ready to sit and talk with the US in the context of the P5+1, focusing only on the nuclear issue. And there they were encouraging both sides to come together to talk on the nuclear issue, because they thought that once the nuclear problem is solved, or the 2 sides have come to an agreement, then the chances of Iran opening up internally, domestically, is much more. But as long as the stalemate continues, there is going to be the repression continues. So I would like to get your Michael, you want to,
Well,
you were there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the thing is that the P5+1 was created specifically and only for the nuclear issue. And at the talk, certainly in Istanbul and Baghdad, Iran very much wanted to widen and bring up Syria and other issues. But the P5+1 says we're willing to talk about anything, but first in the order has to be the nuclear issue. So certainly P5+1 would agree with the former parliamentarians, but Iran definitely sees this as a much wider problem, which goes all the way to the question of normalization of relations eventually. But to cut through this, and the reason there is this rift right now is that, one, the United States and the P5+1 want to deal with the nuclear issue first and specifically, and don't want it to be widened to the larger issue, because the nuclear issue must be dealt with. And number 2, in their insistence on 20%, their point is this process started when Iran was only enriching to 5%, and that they shouldn't be rewarded for enriching to 20%. That first has to be taken off the table, and then you get down to the issue of enrichment. And I think eventually they would accept some enrichment in Iran. But the problem right now is Iran is saying if we give up 20%, we should get sanctions relief in return for it. And that is the irreconcilable gulf now between these two.
Barbara?
Can I
Yeah.
respond to your
Yes.
question? Sorry, Barbara. First of all, Mr. Rafsanjani spoke to some of the reformist journalists a few days ago, and unfortunately some of those journalists were arrested a couple of years later. But one
Now
of
we
the
know
sentences he said, one of the interesting sentences he said, this is the exact quote, he said, if President Obama behaves appropriately, اگر درست رفتار بکنه, Mr. Khamenei will also accept a negotiation. So if Rafsanjani seems to agree with the reformist parliamentarians, but the problem is Mr. Khamenei is not going to initiate it himself. And we have seen that. I mean, the pattern repeats itself. Mr. Khamenei is going to task someone with this idea of negotiating with the Americans, with the P5+1. If it goes well, then he says, well, I was in favor of it anyhow. If it doesn't go well, then he says, I distrusted the Americans from the beginning, and I knew that they should not be trusted. Now, I believe that person will be the next president. So the timeline is important. In that sense, it's very helpful to know that mid-2013 is not that critical, because the next president will come into office in August. Sure. So play the scenario. Mr. Velayati as the next president, potentially, former foreign minister, international relations advisor to Mr. Khamenei. He could be tasked with this job, like at one point Larijani was, 2006. And then let's see what happens. I don't think Mr. Khamenei will publicly commit to that kind of a dialogue. It would be too much against his own narrative.
Refresh my memory. Isn't Mr. Velayati tainted with the Mykonos thing?
But so is Rafsanjani.
Yeah, but he hasn't traveled abroad. But
no, but
Velayati
has. But as soon as he becomes the president, he will have the immunity as the president.
He actually gave a very interesting interview, Velayati in Tehran a few days ago. You can take what he said as being genuine, or you can read between the lines. But he stated very specifically that A, the rumors about him negotiating directly with the United States were false. In Oman, I believe he said. B, the supreme leader is in charge of foreign policy, and the supreme leader has not authorized anyone to talk to the United States. If anybody did, it has nothing to do with the Iranian government. And he also said that the U.S. won't repeat its experience with Iraq and Afghanistan with Iran, meaning the U.S. won't go to war against Iran. And he made a number of very solid, strong, or if you want to call them hardline statements. And he is a potential presidential candidate. So, I mean, he's vigorously denying contacts. Does that mean he has contacted? I don't know. I don't want to speculate. But I'm not sure even if there's a new president. I think marginally it could help. But again, it's what Khamenei decides, because Khamenei is going to tell the next president what to do. And I think that's where the issue is, the unelected ruler of Iran.
Thank you. Barbara?
Yeah, Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council and almonitor.com. Bijan, you sort of started this, but given the complexity of the issue, given all the fruitless rounds of talks, it would seem that a deal has to be pre-cooked in some kind of bilateral channel before the P5+1 can bless it. So I'll just ask, Bijan, you already suggested this is something where the Supreme Leader will have to task someone to go and have those contacts too. Michael, do you and Ali, do you agree that you might have to see this being pre-cooked at some very confidential level, perhaps after the elections, and then, we could see progress?
I think, yes, bilateral U.S.-Iranian negotiations are ideal. That's the way to move forward. It's hard to say how willing Tehran is to engage in those negotiations. I think the United States is very willing. I'm not so sure about Tehran. And I think part of the issue is Khamenei is compared to his predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini, who eventually, as Khomeini said, he drank the poison chalice and accepted the end of the Iran-Iraq war. He had said victory until death, but he conceded, basically, because he faced a lot of pressure from those around him, including within the Revolutionary Guards. And Khamenei, some argue, is less likely to drink the poison chalice. But I think that's really the major stumbling issue for him. I think there's a worry that no matter what he does, whether it's secret negotiations, making some sort of concession, that he's going to be seen as a loser. So I think they're major ideological, political, and personal impediments. But that doesn't really rule out direct negotiations, because I think he is under a lot of pressure. and he's going to be facing a lot more pressure in the future.
Barbara, as you know, the P5+, there already have been bilateral discussions within the framework of the P5+1, 2009, and the one time they actually worked out a deal that was a deal was in 2009. Then when it was taken back to Iran, it fell apart. I don't think anybody in the P5+1 sees bilateral talks between the United States and Iran as inimical to the P5+1 process. There's no resistance to it all. Every diplomat I've spoken to from each country would welcome it. I know the Russians would really like to see the United States sit down with Iran. So no one's against it. And as Ali mentioned, the United States has been eager for it. I think at one point at talks in Istanbul, the U.S. Representative Bill Burns was actually waiting in the hallway for the Iranians to invite him in for talks. It hasn't been that blatant in the past few talks, but the United States wants bilateral talks. Its negotiating allies do not see this as in any way sabotaging what they're doing. And the big question is when Iran finds it in their interest to sit down. And what we've all been referring to is the fact that everybody agrees the process has to go forward. You were mentioning, bilateral contacts. But it's just not there yet. And I really think that if and when they sit down within the P5+1, messages are going to be, if ever it's going to happen, there'll be messages start being passed, where we're going, how we can do things. And only then will we see if any kind of real deal is possible.
Bijan, you wanted to add something?
My personal analysis is that the key components of the deal are already clear. I think the problem is that both sides obviously expect the other side to start. And I think the reason why the Iranians are so keen to expand the basis of negotiations to include other issues like Syria is that way you can introduce new aspects where you can build confidence. Because the issue is confidence. Who is going to give the first, giveaway in the process? And then the big question, if that side does it, especially if Tehran does it, are they going to then look like a fool? Because the other side will say, well, now that you have given up this one, then why don't you continue? And that's this fear of being, slapped in the face, especially for the Iranians. It would be very heavy. And just to one sentence, I agree with Ali Reza that there are constituencies who are, interacting with Khamenei, but part of what Iran is doing is, in fact, targeted at those internal constituencies. Iran is saying it's not for a lack of us trying. We are trying. We are trying to negotiate, but the other side is not doing. So it's a blame game as well here. Don't underestimate the dimension of blaming the other side inside Iran.
Nikayan Kosar from Kholnevis.org. Last week when Mr. Mousavi Khoini was here, he was saying that one of the reasons that the Supreme Leader is somehow for a negotiation with the states is based on what they have seen through, let's say, Kayhan or other hardline newspapers in the reaction to the proposal that the 7 parliamentarians actually offered Obama, Khamenei, and Ashton. And last week when they were here and the report was published, no one in Tehran actually talked about this, so it was totally ignored. In a way, they didn't want to say anything negative to it. So based on that issue, that if we see that Kayhan or other hardliners are silent to this, do you think that something is changing in Tehran or not? That's one. And two, do you think under the next administration, let's say a reformist or Mr. Rafsanjani, I don't call Rafsanjani a reformist, if either of these personalities have a new administration or having a new government, would anything be different under their administrations in the negotiations or not? Thank you.
You take the first part, Bijan, you take the second.
One of the advisors to the Iranian negotiation team His name is Mehdi Mohammadi. He's the deputy editor of Kayhan. He just published an article in a site called Iran Review. It's in English, so it's meant for our consumption. And it was very typical Islamic Republic talk. And he talked about, he specifically said that there's no acceptance of normalizing relations with the United States and the political system of the Islamic Republic, that the United States has to change its behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very hard line, typical fundamentalist Kayhan viewpoint, which I think really represents the viewpoint of the top leadership in Iran. Otherwise, this gentleman wouldn't be offering strategic advice to the negotiation team. And he also stated that he thinks the U.S. is in a weak position because of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and won't attack Iran. So, again, does that mean he really believes that position, or he knows that they're in a weak position, so he's trying to sound strong? I think that's one of the, what they say in public is very different than what they could think privately, and we just don't know really what they think privately. What is this individual thinking privately? When I read it, it sounds like everything the Islamic Republic has been saying for the last 3 decades. And when it comes to the United States, I think they're very ideological in their viewpoints. What the parliamentarians here said, I think makes a lot of sense. And I wish people like that were in power in Tehran. They had some influence. And no, if I'm not trying to be offensive. They had some influence in Iran in the 1990s. They no longer do. If they come back and have influence in Iran, then things could change. I don't see that it being in terms of them controlling the presidency or parliament, because those are not the institutions of power anymore in the Islamic Republic. It's the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards and a few more components. And they have very different viewpoints than the reformists. They think these reformists are more dangerous than the United States. So I think that's one of the main issues right there.
Generally, the power structure in Iran, and I'm sure you appreciate that, is a scene of ongoing give and takes between different players, and the relationship between Khamenei as the supreme leader and the government, especially the president, is subject to all these continuous bargaining processes and give and takes. And I think the next president could potentially be in a position to ask for new experiments, if you want, in foreign policy, and to ask Mr. Khamenei to show some flexibility under new circumstances. For example, arguing, look, there is John Kerry is the state, Secretary of State, Chuck Hagel is the Secretary of Defense. The situation has changed. They're pro-dialogue, etc., etc. And as I said, Mr. Khamenei, and it wouldn't be the first time, will allow those experiments, especially, and this is where it went sour with Ahmadinejad, especially if the new president does not challenge Khamenei's position in power, because that's the big fear. If that was, for example, if Khatami would have gotten the credit for resolving Iran-US issue, the Iran-US issue, he would have suddenly become too powerful for the structure. Ahmadinejad, in a different way, was driving a completely different agenda. Now imagine Velayati, Haddad Adel, people who are, close to Khamenei and who are not challenging Khamenei. When Velayati comes in that interview and says, this is the forte of the supreme leader, he's saying, I'm not going to challenge that thing. Even Rafsanjani, in the same speech 2 days ago, says the only way out we have right now is to cooperate with the leader. He says that. He says that very clearly. This is the only way out. I can't challenge him. So if the next president is someone who knows how to juggle between the different power centers and push for a new experiment and then succeeds in that experiment, then there will be new openings. But if it's a person who will challenge Khamenei, who will not have the creativity of coming up with new ideas, then it will just stall the way it is.
Charlie, did you have a question? No.
There is
Yes,
one person.
here. Sure.
Hello, Sean Mann with Georgetown University. How durable is the international sanctions regime? Certainly Congress is set on it, but it's actually implemented by South Korea, European countries, Japan, Turkey, the ones who are actually cutting off economic engagement with Iran. What appetite is there for longer term or increased stricter sanctions in these countries? How does Iran see the durability or fragility of the sanction regime, and how does that change its calculations in terms of negotiation?
I think that's a very good question. The sanctions regime is durable in the sense it's ongoing. They're trying to batten down ways in which Iran may have been trying to get around it with barter and with gold, and they feel they can increase it more. And what's happening is that both sides may think they have time on their side, but from the Western point of view, the longer sanctions run, the more pain Iran will feel and the more they're likely to cut a deal. So there's a feeling that the sanctions are, for the first time in the history of this crisis, really taking effect and beyond, to some extent, backed up some of that, but it's also clear they're not devastating the Iranian economy. And if you can speak to people here in this town who are imposing the sanctions, they would say, we need some more time. So that's another reason this crisis has more legs to run, because the feeling is, give it a few more months, give it half a year, and maybe Iran will be more willing to cut a deal.
Yes. And this is going to be our last question.
Benjamin, to a retired Foreign Service officer. Would the panelists comment on a couple of IAEA statements attributed to the Director General? And the first is a statement that Israel should seek to resolve its problems with Iran diplomatically. The second is on the importance of a successful Middle East nuclear weapons free zone conference and the connection between that and the Iranian push to have the next round of talks in Cairo.
Thank you. Bijan, there was a question from the overflow addressed to you. Can you please talk about the Israeli angle? I can't understand what the Israeli angle is, but maybe Iran-Israel or whatever, where we stand now. But
Okay.
briefly.
I don't understand a question, but yeah. I'll just say something because I'm a good Iranian. But I guess, I mean, I can say the strategic landscape in the region, which is obviously the region where Israel and Iran are competing strategically, is changing. In Syria is just one element, but Egypt is changing. You know, there are important events in Iraq, in Turkey, whatever, Kurdistan, emergence of a Iraqi Kurdistan. And I think what I would say about Iran and Israel is that both of them are very, very confused about this new strategic landscape. And this confusion translates into a desire to have to underline the existence of an enemy, especially from an Israeli point of view, but also from an Iranian point of view. I mean, Iran doesn't have a shortage of enemies that it can bring to fore, but obviously for Israel, it's Iran. And I think this part of this animosity, and that connects well to your question, can be resolved diplomatically, but Iran is not going to recognize Israel, at least not before there is some degree of de-escalation in Iran's relations with the Western world. So it's a big challenge to ask the Iranians and the Israelis to resolve the issue diplomatically, but maybe Iran-US de-escalation could help down the line.
I think one of the reasons Iran finds itself in such a terrible situation is the regime's ideological approach to Israel, that no matter what Iran faces, no matter how many sanctions and how much isolation, that they view it as their duty to combat Israel And I think in the last few years, this has proven to be a losing strategy for them, with their president denying the Holocaust, with them developing programs that can target Israel and explicitly making statements against Israel. I think this has made imposing sanctions on Iran a lot easier. And I think it demonstrates the Ahmadinejad's poor use of diplomacy overall. As long as the Islamic Republic has these ideological policies, then you can't really solve the overall sense of crisis with the regime. Like I said, I don't think it's just about the nuclear program. It's about everything else. And one of the major issues is the Islamic Republic's hostility toward Israel.
Thank you. Michael, you want to add your take on this?
Well, I really agree with what Ali was saying, and I wonder if in a change in administration they will try to defuse that rhetoric, because it's been so counterproductive for Iran. And Iran's real problem, I think, is the United States and its predominance in the region. And obviously the first step is to deal with the United States. And also Israel has certainly toned down its threats and its rhetoric to give way to this push for diplomacy.
And the nuclear-free zone.
And the nuclear-free zone,
Oh.
Michael, you want to take
You know, even that and even the IAEA investigation of Iran are, in terms of the efforts to deal with the nuclear crisis, sideshows. And the only show in town is the P5+1 and the negotiations with Iran. And I think you should not think that what happens in Vienna and what happens with the IAEA investigation has that much influence on what's happening with the P5+1 process.
Let me ask you one last question quickly. Die Welt carried an article 3 days ago, saying that there was an explosion in Fordo. And of course, the Iranian government immediately denied it. But Die Welt is not your tabloid, which was what do we know about it?
Well, the report came from a person who said he worked for the CIA, and he's
Former Revolutionary
from
Guards
Revolutionary
officer,
Guards,
he claims.
and just from that one source, and it was in one newspaper. It's denied very strongly by the United States. I asked someone about it before coming here today, and I got the answer, it's pure fiction. So
It's very dubious. I don't understand why various media outlets picked up on this story, and it's just spread around the internet. But if you look at the original source, it's almost like fiction.
I mean,
But-
I agree, but Die Welt is
But he
for
probably-
those of us who, are familiar.
Well, a
with
lot
Die
of
Welt,
a lot of
I don't
publications
know
picked up on this story.
you get these
Yeah.
things that are kind of,
without verifying.
All it takes is one
It also-
relatively serious site to pick up on this story, and then everybody.
it also.
But don't understand. I mean, one pattern that we have seen over the past decade is that every time there is some suggestion that maybe there will be some de-escalation, then things like that happen. And I call them spoiling activity. So this is a spoiling activity alert right now, I think.
There were a number of stories. There was another story about an explosion in Esfahan that was unproven to be true.
There's
So
a story about bilateral meetings that American officials went to meetings in Dubai with the Iranians.
We are going to have a series of meetings on Iran between now and, I was going to say the elections, but I believe between now and eternity. So please join us for all the upcoming meetings, and join me in thanking our panelists.
Very good to see you. We have lunch again.
yeah, definitely.
Okay, Jonah.
So good to see you.
So good to see you. How's Bahir?
Hey, how are you?
خیلی ممنون.
خواهش می‌کنم. مرسی اندرو.